I'm Professor Kenneth Hansen, coordinator of the University of Central Florida Judaic Studies program, and I'd like to share an exciting new video course called Judaism and Jesus, in this episode focusing on the sect referred to as the Pious Ones, that is, as they are known in Hebrew, the Hasidim.
Sherlock Holmes here. One of the most curiously enigmatic of all the sectarian movements thought to have existed in the Second Jewish Commonwealth is referred to in textual sources from the period, possibly including the Psalms, as the Pious Ones.
But who exactly were they, and what have they to do with Jesus of Nazareth? It seems to me, Holmes, that some serious textual sleuthing is in order.
Indeed, Watson, who were these Pious Ones, and when do we first encounter them? The reconstruction of this sectarian group is a daunting task, but one that has significant implications with respect to the serious research of Second Temple Judaism, and as a sidelight, the historical Jesus.
We first come upon the Hebrew term pious, that is, Hasid or Hasid, in the texts of the Scriptures, though it appears to be a generic reference to people of piety and upright character, especially individuals considered consecrated and set apart from others. We might ask, if such a group of pietists existed, whether or not they are mentioned in the Psalms, might they have become the core of those who formerly came to be known as the Hasidim, the first recorded mention of whom is found in the book of 1 Maccabees? A possible reference to those freedom fighters may be found in Psalm 149, which praises a group of fighting saints, the Hebrew term being Hasidim. Ya'alzu Hasidim b'chavod, yoranenu al mishkavotam. Let the saints exult in glory, let them sing for joy upon their beds. Psalm 149, 5. Some scholars argue that these Hasidim, along with certain other references in the book of Psalms, in fact represent those who fought alongside the Maccabees from 168 to 164 BCE. That, of course, is far from certain, but it's nonetheless possible that the Hasidim of the Maccabean revolt were either the same group or grew out of the same group mentioned in Psalms. Importantly, one passage makes direct mention of the Hasidim with respect to their decision to join Mattathias and his company in their struggle against Seleucid domination of the land of Israel. Then was assembled to them the congregation of the Hasideans, the stoutest of Israel, exceedingly forceful, every one that had a good will for the law. 1 Maccabees 2:42. What strikes us immediately is the militancy of the passage, and the fact that these pietists were said to be capable of assembling a sizable military force. The idea is bolstered by a separate account of the same events in 2 Maccabees, which goes as far as to declare Judah Maccabee as their captain. They among the Jews that are called Hasideans, of whom Judas Maccabeus is captain, nourish wars and raise seditions, and will not suffer the realm to be in peace. 2 Maccabees 14:6. Hercule Poirot here, of Agatha Christie fame. We should all know that good scholars are equally good detectives. In this instance, let's call it the case of the Hasidim. Many scholars assume that these early Hasidim were of an exceptionally violent character. However, it is noteworthy that references to the Hasidim in the books of Maccabees do not indicate that they arose for the purpose of battling the Seleucids. They simply have turned to violence in the face of the Antiochian persecution. That fact is particularly relevant given the notion advanced by a number of scholars that the militant Hasidim of the Maccabean revolt are to be distinguished from a later, thoroughly non-militant group of pietists. These later Hasidim were presumably akin to the world of the sages, who referenced them as men of such reverent character that one would be hard-pressed to imagine them taking up the sword under any circumstances. Some scholars have gone as far as to make a direct link between the later, presumably non-militant Hasidim and the historical Jesus. Was Yeshua linked in tone and substance with this reorganized group of Hasidim? Some point out that this particular movement of Hasidim, referenced in rabbinic literature, were known for having fused religious zeal with the working of miracles. Others question whether these Hasidim ever existed at all.
We should still ask, as astute detectives, were these later miracle workers, including Yeshua, indeed Hasidim, perhaps the direct offshoots of the Maccabean Hasidim? It may well be that the whole concept of the Hasid evolved through various stages, from the biblical description of the righteous person to the pietists of the Maccabean period, who joined the revolution against the Seleucids, to those of unique sanctity and holiness, combined with mystical and ascetic characteristics of later periods.
We might also make a case that while they may have adopted different attitudes than their forebears with regard to various matters, including ritual purity, they were not necessarily less militant or zealous with regard to national liberation. That said, let's have a look at Choni HaMe'agel, or Choni the Circle Maker, generally considered a Hasid. During a long drought, he audaciously drew a circle in the dust, stood in the center, and declared, Ribono shel olam, banecha samu panehem alai, she'ani keben bait lefanecha, nishba ani b'shimcha hagadol, she'eini zaz mikan, ad sheterachem al banecha. Master of the universe, your children have turned their faces to me, for I am like a member of your household. I swear by your great name that I will not budge from here until you have pity on your children. Mishnah Ta'anit 3:8. Shortly thereafter, it began to rain. We are told that the pre-Tanaitic sage Shimon ben Shetach declared, Il malech choni ata, gozrani alecha nidui, אבל מה אעשה לך, שאתה מתחטא לפני המקום, ועושה לך רצונך, כבן שהוא מתחטא על אביו, ועושה לו רצונו. If you were not honey, I would surely place you under a ban. But what can I do to you? For you act like a spoiled child before God, and nevertheless God accedes to your requests. The manner of the circle maker's death is even more telling when it comes to distinguishing between the early militant and later pacifistic Hasidim. Josephus records that around 63 BCE, during the internecine warfare between the sons of Queen Shlomtzion, Aristobulus II, and Hyrcanus II, Choni was taken prisoner by the latter and asked to offer prayer on his behalf and against his foe. Choni's response typifies the non-violent approach of the later reorganized Hasidim. Lord of the universe, as the besieged and the besiegers both belong to your people, I beseech you not to answer the evil prayers of either. Josephus, Antiquities of the Jews, 14:2-121. Josephus continues, he was thereupon stoned to death. It's certainly tempting to compare the much vaunted non-violent approach of Jesus with that of the circle maker, and view them both as Hasidim of the post-Maccabean variety. But this is far from conclusive, given the fact that such characters are never called Hasidim per se. Some prefer to characterize them as charismatic solitaires at the margins of the early rabbinic movement. But however tempting to compare Jesus with Choni HaMe'agel and to see them both as non-militant, pacifistic pietists, it's equally important to recognize the dramatic difference between the events driving the Maccabean revolt and those involving two brothers squabbling for succession to the throne of Queen Shlomtzion. We need see no contradiction between the full-throated support of the Maccabean freedom fighters by the early Hasidim and the seemingly pacifistic response of at least one of their spiritual descendants to the fratricidal conduct of Aristobulus II and Hyrcanus II. As with the story of Choni, much of our analysis depends upon rabbinic literature, which specifically mentions a group of pietists known as Hasidim Harishonim, the pious men of old, or first Hasidim, who were said to be rigorous in observing the Torah, even beyond its literal sense. The Mishnah, Berachot 5:1, and the Babylonian Talmud, Berachot 32b, depict them as emptying their minds and directing their hearts to God an hour prior to prayer. Other scrupulous conduct is said to have involved attaching fringes to the corners of their garments after only 3 handbreadths had been woven, consorting with their wives only on Wednesdays in the hope that a child would not be born on the Sabbath, and burying thorns and broken glass at 3 handbreadths to avoid the possibility of doing harm to others, Baba Kama 30a. It was even said that some perished as a result of purging themselves so as to enter the world to come in a state of ritual purity. But which Hasidim were these? Those of the Maccabean era, or those to whom Choni HaMe'agel belonged? While such accounts were composed long after the fact, they are at the very least evidence that although such pietists, Harishonim, no longer existed as a distinct group by the time the Mishnah was redacted, they were nonetheless believed to have been extremely zealous for the law. The lingering question is whether both groups of Hasidim, the allies of the Maccabees, and their reorganized counterparts, were equally zealous in the pursuit of peace. Some argue that Talmudic examples of the later non-militant class of Hasidim include the Galilean disciple of Yochanan ben Zakkai, famously non-militant in his own right, Hanina ben Dosa, who was recounted in the Mishnah as praying over the sick, as Jesus was said to do in the Christian Gospels, announcing who would live and who would die. When asked how he could be certain, he would reply, Im shegorat tfilati befi, yodea ani shehu mekubal, ve'im lo, yodea ani shehu metoraf. If my prayer is fluent in my mouth, I know that it is accepted, but if not, I know that it is rejected. Some have also found parallels with the worldview of the Hasidim in certain parables appearing in rabbinic literature. A case in point relates to the issue of whether study took precedence over good deeds or vice versa. The later Hasidim stressed the redemptive role of action, as expressed, not surprisingly, by Hanina ben Dosa. Kol sheyirat chet'o kodemet lechochmato, chochmato mitkayemet. V'chol shechochmato kodemet leyirat chet'o, ein chochmato mitkayemet. He in whom the fear of sin takes precedence of wisdom, his wisdom will endure. But he in whom wisdom takes precedence of his fear of sin, his wisdom will not endure. This theme is also prominent in the teaching of Jesus.
Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven.
This was also the position of Shimon ben Gamliel, though later overturned by the sages in 120 CE, who classically declared, Velo hamidrash hu ha'ikar, ela ha'ma'aseh. Not learning, but doing is the chief thing. Likewise, in Tanah Debe Eliyahu Rabbah 17, it's said that the man whose deeds exceed his wisdom is blessed. The Torah of Jesus, therefore, appears to coincide closely with that of the Hasidim, leading not a few scholars to conclude that the Nazarene was himself a Hasid. For their part, the sages may well have engaged in a good deal of rewriting history in order to depict the whole of Israelite society, save the despised zealots, as lovers of peace and pursuers of peace. In rabbinic parlance, rodfei shalom. Their motive was doubtless for internal consumption as well, to discourage the kind of rebelliousness among the people that had brought on these catastrophes in the first place. Indeed, the entirety of rabbinic literature is largely void of references to the zealot faction, almost as if they never existed. The violent aspects of other societal currents would be downplayed by the sages, while emphasizing, in the case of the Hasidim, only their piety. Considering the clear reluctance of the sages to endorse warfare, we might consider the possibility that pacifistic portrayals of pious individuals such as Honi may well amount to anachronistic reinterpretations, at least on some levels. In a different context, when it comes to the attitude of Yeshua and his followers toward militancy, a careful review of early Christian sources seems to suggest a similar skewed portrait. Just as the sages were determined to recast Judaism as a religion of peace, a similar process of demilitarizing a textual tradition is likely to have taken place among those who recorded the Torah of Jesus, as expressed in the Christian Gospels. The Christian patriarchs, following the venerable footsteps of the Apostle Paul, were just as determined to avoid the impression that they represented any threat to Roman rule.
With regard to Jesus' research as a whole, we might argue that the main problem is the attempt to cast the Nazarene in one mold or another. As with many historical figures, assuming Jesus to be historical, a truthful picture is much more complex. To dismiss any hint of militant nationalism in the narratives and/or teachings of Jesus is at best naive, but it is equally mistaken to claim that he was a full-throated zealot who was executed for his subversive anti-Roman agitation.
In sum, we're attempting to thread the needle in terms of how we are to understand the Hasidim and Yeshua of Nazareth in relation to their attitudes toward violent militarism. It seems clear enough that the illustrious Nazarene was too much linked to the Judaism of his day to be categorized merely as a magician, but it's equally misleading to cast him in radically insurrectionist zealot tones, as if he were one with Hezekiah the Galilean, whom Herod had murdered as a threat to Roman hegemony.
Thanks to the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have a vivid example of how a sectarian movement could be devoted to strict piety, while at the same time imploring divine aid in the cause of liberation from the Roman yoke. It's likely in the end that the Dead Sea sectarians did indeed join the Great Revolt against Rome, given the archaeological evidence of scroll fragments discovered on Masada. In their minds, this must have been the apocalyptic war they had expected, and their participation in it is by no means inconsistent with their earlier pacifism. Had Jesus lived 3 decades later, might he too have joined the Great Revolt? This question deserves a great deal more reflection and, yes, sleuthing.